10 years. 10 long years since Madison heard her father's voice. Now here he lies, pale and fragile, machines keeping him alive. The irony isn't lost on her. You chose a papist over your own family. Get out of my house and never come back. His words still echo in Madison's mind like a curse she can't escape. But Alessandro gave Madison a life her father never could. Love without conditions. A family built on acceptance, not judgment. Two beautiful children who speak both English and Italian. Madison, please, your father collapsed during his sermon. The doctors say his heart. He might not make it through the night. Linda doesn't deserve to ask, but she pleads anyway. 5 hours of driving through darkness. Madison questions everything. Should she even care about the man who disowned her? Who called her husband evil? Who missed everything that mattered? Madison's wedding day should have been perfect. Instead, she walked down the aisle alone, her father's absence more painful than any physical wound. Alessandro's friends became her family that day. When Isabella was born, Madison sent pictures hoping his heart would soften. The envelope came back marked return to sender. Her own father rejected his first grandchild without even seeing her face. "Mommy, why don't we have grandparents like other kids?" Isabella asked once. How do you explain hate to an innocent child? How do you tell them their grandfather chose pride over love? Robert's hand feels so cold, so fragile. This powerful man who ruled his congregation with fire and brimstone now lies helpless. Despite everything, Madison's heart breaks for him. You're no daughter of mine. You've chosen that foreign Catholic over the family that raised you. Don't you dare come back here. The last words he ever spoke to Madison. Alessandro told Madison to come. Forgiveness isn't for him, Madison. It's for you. Her husband, the man her father called evil, taught her more about Christian love than any sermon ever did. Robert publicly announced Madison's fall from grace to the entire congregation. Said she was lost to the world, influenced by foreign corruption. The humiliation broke Linda's heart completely. Madison, Tyler's voice trembles. Her brother, who stood silent when father threw her out, now looks at her with tears in his eyes. 10 years of regret written across his face. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone, Madison was erased from their lives like she never existed. But the absence of love leaves a mark deeper than its presence ever could. Madison whispers a prayer she's not sure she believes. After everything Robert did, she's still here. Please don't let him die with this hatred between them. Alessandro brought the children despite the distance. They should meet their grandfather, he said. Even now, he shows more grace than the man who condemned him as evil. How is he? Alessandro asks, holding Madison like he's done for 10 years, unconditionally, completely. The man her father called a threat to their faith became her salvation. Madison remembers the first time she saw Alessandro treating children at the free clinic. His gentleness, his compassion, she knew immediately this was a man of God, regardless of denomination. Is that really Grandpa? Isabella whispers. These innocent children, about to meet the grandfather who rejected them before they were born. Will this be their first and last meeting? Suddenly the machines start screaming. He's crashing, the nurse shouts. After all these years, is Madison too late? Will Robert die without ever knowing the grandchildren he abandoned? Where are you watching from today? Have you ever had to choose between family and love? Let us know in the comments below, and please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. This is just the beginning. 5 years earlier, Madison spent her Saturday mornings at the Cincinnati Refugee Resettlement Center. As a teacher, she felt called to help families who had fled their homelands seeking safety and new beginnings. The center buzzed with activity as volunteers helped newly arrived families navigate their first weeks in America. Madison coordinated English tutoring, helped with job applications, and organized donations of clothing and household items. That October morning, she noticed an unfamiliar volunteer in the medical area, his gentle voice speaking to refugee children in what sounded like multiple languages. "Excuse me, are you working with our medical volunteers today?" Madison approached the tall man in the white coat who was carefully bandaging a young Syrian girl's scraped elbow. "I'm Dr. Alessandro Romani," he replied with a slight Italian accent, his warm brown eyes meeting hers briefly before returning attention to his small patient. "I heard you provide medical care for refugee families. I wanted to volunteer my services." Madison watched as he spoke gently to the frightened child in Arabic, somehow making her giggle despite the language barrier. His natural ease with these traumatized children impressed her immediately. What Madison witnessed next took her breath away. Alessandro sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by refugee children from Somalia, Syria, and Afghanistan. Despite speaking different languages, he connected with each child through smiles, gentle touches, and simple games that transcended words. A little Somali boy who hadn't spoken since arriving clung to Alessandro's hand. He lost his father in the crossing. The boy's mother whispered to Madison in broken English. Yet somehow, this Italian stranger was coaxing the first smile they'd seen from the child in weeks. Madison felt something stir in her chest watching this beautiful interaction. During their coffee break, Alessandro shared his perspective on helping refugees. "In Italy, my family took in displaced families during the Kosovo crisis," he explained, stirring his espresso thoughtfully. "My grandmother always said suffering has no nationality." Madison found herself fascinated by his worldview, so different from her sheltered Ohio upbringing. When she mentioned her Protestant church's mission work, she noticed him smile warmly. "Ah, you're Protestant," he said gently. "I'm Catholic myself. Different traditions, same calling to serve, no?" Something in his tone made Madison feel both intrigued and slightly uncertain about the denominational difference. Working alongside Alessandro felt surprisingly natural, despite their different backgrounds. He treated each refugee family with dignity and respect, never showing pity but genuine compassion. When an elderly Afghan man needed translation, Alessandro seamlessly found a Farsi speaker among the volunteers. Madison admired his resourcefulness and cultural sensitivity. "You seem to understand what these families need," she observed. "Perhaps because I know what it's like to be foreign in a new place," he replied thoughtfully. "When I first came to America for my residency, everything felt strange and overwhelming. Kindness from strangers made all the difference." Madison assisted as Alessandro examined a pregnant Eritrean woman who spoke no English. Through an interpreter, they learned she'd walked hundreds of miles while pregnant, fleeing persecution. Alessandro's hands were incredibly gentle as he checked her condition, his voice soothing despite the language barrier. "Her baby is strong," he told the interpreter with a smile that needed no translation. The woman's tears of relief moved Madison deeply. She watched Alessandro pray quietly in what sounded like Latin, making the sign of the cross. The Catholic gesture made Madison briefly think of her father's strong opinions about popish practices, but she pushed the uncomfortable thought away. "Would you like to continue our conversation over dinner?" Alessandro asked as they packed up for the day, his formal politeness charming yet nervous. "I find your perspective on education and service quite fascinating." Madison hesitated for just a moment, thinking of how different their backgrounds were, his Catholic Italian heritage versus her Protestant American upbringing. But the way he cared for those refugee children, the genuine compassion in his eyes, spoke to something deeper than denominational differences. "I'd like that very much," she replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Over authentic Italian cuisine, their conversation flowed between serious topics and playful banter. Alessandro spoke passionately about his medical training in Rome, his family's bakery, and the saints his grandmother invoked for every occasion. Madison shared stories of her students, her church youth group, and her family's deep Protestant roots in Ohio. When Alessandro mentioned attending daily Mass, Madison felt a flutter of anxiety remembering her father's sermons about Catholic errors. But watching Alessandro's face light up as he described his faith, she saw only sincerity and devotion. Perhaps denominational differences weren't as important as she'd been taught to believe. "I had a wonderful evening, Madison," Alessandro said softly as they stood by her car. Would you think me too forward if I asked to see you again? Perhaps we could visit that art museum you mentioned." The hope in his voice matched the flutter in her chest. Madison knew she was standing at a crossroads. This man represented everything unfamiliar yet appealing. His Catholic faith, his Italian heritage, his worldly experience all differed from her carefully ordered Protestant life. Yet his noble character, his compassion for refugees, his gentle strength drew her like nothing she'd ever experienced. "I'd love that," she whispered, knowing she was choosing to explore something that might change everything. That night, Madison stared at her ceiling, replaying every moment with Alessandro. His gentle hands with the refugee children, his passionate faith, the way he made her feel both challenged and cherished. She'd never met anyone who combined such sophistication with such humility. But nagging questions crept in. What would her family think about his Catholic faith? Could love bridge such different religious traditions? A part of her whispered that she should be careful, that good Protestant girls didn't fall for Catholic foreigners. Yet her heart had already begun to recognize something precious in this compassionate Italian doctor who treated refugee children like they were his own. Over the following months, Madison and Alessandro's relationship grew deeper through secret meetings hidden from her family. They chose quiet locations away from her neighborhood, places where her father's congregation members wouldn't spot them together. Madison felt the thrill and guilt of secrecy as they met in distant parks, small cafes across town, and dimly lit restaurants where no one would recognize the pastor's daughter with a foreign man. The need to hide their growing love added intensity to every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every gentle touch when no one was watching. She hated the deception, but wasn't ready to face her family's inevitable reaction to her relationship with a Catholic man who carried secrets from his past. During one of their secret dinners, Alessandro began sharing the dramatic story that had shaped his life and brought him to America. "There's something about my past I need you to understand," he said, his voice heavy with emotion and pain he rarely discussed. "I wasn't born in Italy, as I've let people assume. My family is originally from Syria, from a beautiful city called Aleppo." Madison's eyes widened as she realized the man she was falling in love with carried secrets much deeper than she had imagined. "We lived there peacefully for generations until the Civil War tore everything apart," Alessandro continued, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "What happened to us there? It changed everything about who I am and why I do the work I do." In his apartment, Alessandro showed Madison the few precious photos his family had managed to save from their dramatic escape from Syria. "This was our home in Aleppo," he said, pointing to a picture of a beautiful stone house with a garden. "My father was a doctor there, and my mother taught at the university. We had a good life, a peaceful life, until the bombs started falling." Madison saw the pain in his eyes as he described the night their neighborhood was attacked, how they huddled in the basement listening to explosions getting closer and closer. "We lost everything in one night. Our home, our livelihood, our sense of safety. But that wasn't the worst part," he whispered, his voice breaking with grief that still felt fresh after all these years. "The worst part was losing my family," Alessandro continued, tears now flowing freely down his face as Madison held his hands. "During our escape, we got separated in the chaos at the border. My parents, my younger sister Sophia, my grandmother, they were supposed to meet us at a refugee camp in Jordan, but they never arrived." Madison felt her heart breaking as she watched this strong, compassionate man crumble under the weight of his loss. "I spent 2 years searching every camp, every refugee database, every hospital record I could find. They simply vanished, probably killed in the bombing raids or during the dangerous journey. I came to America alone, changed my name from Ahmad to Alessandro, and tried to build a new life from nothing." Now Madison understood his deep compassion for refugees, his dedication to healing. He was trying to save others because he couldn't save his own family. Madison began carefully introducing Alessandro to a few trusted friends who wouldn't report back to her family. At a coffee shop far from her father's church, she introduced him to her college roommate, Jessica, who immediately warmed to his genuine kindness and obvious devotion to Madison. He's absolutely wonderful, Jessica whispered when Alessandro stepped away to take a call from the hospital. But Madison, you know your father's going to completely lose it when he finds out about this, right? A man with a refugee background who's probably not even Christian. The reminder of her family's likely reaction cast a shadow over Madison's happiness. But watching Alessandro laugh with her friends, seeing how naturally he fit into her world, made her more determined than ever to find a way to make this relationship work despite the obstacles ahead. At a dinner party with Madison's teacher friends, Alessandro charmed everyone with his stories of working with refugee families and his passionate commitment to serving underserved communities. Madison felt proud watching him connect so naturally with people who share their values of education and service to others. But when one friend innocently asked, "Madison, why haven't you brought Alessandro around to meet your family yet? He seems perfect for you." The room fell uncomfortably silent. Madison felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she made vague excuses about everyone being too busy with work schedules, while Alessandro squeezed her hand under the table in understanding support. The weight of keeping their relationship secret from her family was becoming harder to bear, especially knowing the tragic story of loss and survival that had brought Alessandro into her life. During an evening walk in a park far from her neighborhood, Madison opened up about the emotional toll their secrecy was taking on her. "I hate that we have to sneak around like we're doing something shameful," she confessed, her frustration evident in her voice. "Every Sunday at church, every family dinner, I feel like I'm living a double life, lying to the people I love most." Alessandro listened patiently as she voiced her deepest fears about her father's reaction, knowing now that her family's prejudices would be even stronger against a Syrian refugee. "But I'm not ready to lose them," she admitted through tears. "And I'm terrified that when they learn your real story, your background, they'll never accept you." Alessandro stopped walking and pulled her into his arms, understanding better than anyone what it meant to lose family, and not wanting Madison to experience that same devastating loss. Back in Alessandro's apartment that evening, their conversation reached an emotional breakthrough that changed everything between them. "Madison," Alessandro said suddenly, his voice trembling with emotion he could no longer contain, "I need you to know something that I can't keep inside any longer. I've fallen completely, hopelessly in love with you." Her heart nearly stopped as she looked into his sincere brown eyes, seeing vulnerability and hope warring in his expression. "These months with you have been the happiest I've known since losing my family. You've given me something I thought I'd never have again, a reason to hope for the future." Madison felt tears spring to her eyes as overwhelming emotion flooded through her. "I love you too, Alessandro," she whispered, finally saying the words that had been growing in her heart despite all the complications his story had revealed. Their confession of love opened floodgates of emotion they had both been carefully holding back for weeks. "I've never felt anything like this before," Madison said as they held each other tightly on his couch, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Knowing your story, understanding what you've survived, it makes me love you even more." Alessandro stroked her hair gently, his own emotions overwhelming him after years of carrying his grief alone. "You've helped me believe that maybe I deserve happiness again," he said softly. "That maybe losing my family doesn't mean I'm destined to be alone forever." They talked until dawn about their dreams, their fears, and their growing certainty that they were meant to build a new family together, despite all the obstacles that lay ahead with her conservative Protestant family. 2 weeks after their declaration of love, Alessandro brought up the conversation they both knew was inevitable during dinner at their favorite secluded restaurant. "Madison, I can't keep pretending this is just casual dating," he said, his voice steady with determination despite knowing the challenges ahead. "I love you completely, and I want to spend my life with you. I want to marry you, build a family with you, face whatever storms come our way together." Madison's breath caught as she realized this was the moment that would define their entire future together. "I want that too," she replied, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "But Alessandro, my family's going to fight this with everything they have. When they learn about your background, your real story, they'll see it as the ultimate betrayal of everything they believe. He squeezed her hands across the table, his brown eyes filled with the same determination that had carried him through losing everything once before. The moment Madison had been dreading for months finally arrived on a quiet Sunday evening in her parents' living room. She had rehearsed this conversation countless times, but sitting across from her father Robert and mother Linda, she felt her carefully planned words dissolving into panic. "Mom, Dad, there's something very important I need to tell you both," she began, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound confident. Robert looked up from his sermon notes with the stern expression she remembered from childhood discipline, while Linda set down her knitting with a mother's intuitive sense that something life-changing was about to be revealed. The weight of her secret relationship and engagement to Alessandro pressed down on Madison like a physical force as she struggled to find the courage to speak the words that would shatter their world forever. "I've been seeing someone for almost a year now," Madison finally managed to say, watching her parents' expressions shift from mild curiosity to sharp attention. "His name is Alessandro, and we've fallen deeply in love." Robert's eyes immediately narrowed as he processed why his daughter would keep such a significant relationship secret for so long. "A year?" Linda asked softly, hurt evident in her voice that Madison hadn't shared this important part of her life with them. "Why haven't we met him, sweetheart? Why all the secrecy?" Madison felt her heart racing as she prepared to deliver the news that would change everything. "Because I knew you might not approve of him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And because there's more I need to tell you. We're engaged. We're planning to get married." The silence that followed Madison's announcement was deafening, broken only by Linda's sharp gasp and the sound of Robert's sermon notes scattering to the floor as he stood abruptly. "Engaged?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet, the calm before a storm that Madison knew was coming. "You're planning to marry a man we've never met, someone you've hidden from us for an entire year?" Madison nodded, knowing there was no turning back now. "He's Catholic, Dad, and he's originally from Syria. He came here as a refugee after losing his family in the war." She watched her father's face transform from confusion to horror to absolute rage as the full implications of her revelation hit him. "Please, just listen before you react. Alessandro is a wonderful man, a doctor who dedicates his life to helping others. His faith is sincere and beautiful. Catholic? Syrian refugee?" Robert's voice exploded through the room with a fury Madison had never witnessed before. "Madison Elizabeth Morrison, you want to marry a foreign papist who's probably using you for citizenship?" The accusation hit like a physical blow, and Madison felt her own anger rising to match her father's intensity. "He's not using me for anything. Alessandro is more faithful than most people in your congregation. You should see how he cares for refugee families, how he serves those who have nothing." But Robert was beyond reason, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I've preached against the errors of Catholicism for decades. How could you betray everything I've taught you? How could you plan to marry into that corruption?" Linda sat frozen, tears streaming down her face as she watched her family tear itself apart. "This isn't about his faith, it's about love." Madison shot back, her voice rising to match her father's volume. "Alessandro lost everything. His parents, his sister, his entire family disappeared during their escape from Syria. He came here alone and built a life dedicated to helping others. He's the most compassionate man I've ever known." Robert's face turned red with rage as he processed this information. "A Syrian refugee who claims to be Catholic? Madison, can't you see he's lying to you? These people will say anything to get what they want from Americans." The prejudice and hatred in her father's voice made Madison's stomach turn with disgust. "How can you call yourself a Christian and speak with such hatred about someone you've never even met?" she demanded. "You're judging him based on fear and ignorance, not truth." "This marriage will not happen," Robert declared with the absolute authority he wielded from his pulpit. "You will end this engagement immediately and cut all contact with this man, or you will no longer be my daughter." The ultimatum landed like a death sentence, and Madison felt the room spinning around her. Linda finally found her voice, reaching desperately for her husband's arm. "Robert, please, she's our daughter. Surely we can work this out somehow." But Robert shook her off with cold determination. "The congregation looks to us as an example of Christian family values. I will not have my daughter marry a foreign refugee who worships false doctrine. The shame would destroy my ministry and our family's reputation." Madison stared at her father in horror, realizing that his concern was more about his pastoral image than her happiness. "So your reputation matters more than my love and happiness?" she asked, her voice breaking. Tyler walked through the front door just as the confrontation reached its peak, immediately sensing the devastating tension that filled the house. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between his sister's tear-stained face and his father's rigid fury. "Your sister has been secretly engaged to a Syrian refugee Catholic for God knows how long," Robert announced with disgust, as if the words themselves were toxic. Tyler's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, shock, and then disappointment as he processed this information. "Madison, what were you thinking?" he asked, his voice filled with the same judgment she'd heard from their father. "You know, Dad taught us about the dangers of interfaith marriage. How could you get involved with someone so different?" Madison felt her heart break as she realized that even Tyler, whom she'd hoped might show understanding, was choosing their father's prejudices over her happiness. "Linda, you need to support me on this," Robert demanded, turning to his wife with expectation that she would fall in line with his decision. "Our daughter is making the biggest mistake of her life, and we need to present a united front to save her from this disaster." Linda looked between her husband of 30 years and the daughter she'd raised with such love and pride, her face a mask of agony as she was forced to choose sides. "Madison, sweetheart," Linda said softly, her voice breaking with emotion, "maybe your father is right. Maybe you should reconsider this engagement. Marriage is hard enough without all these complications." The betrayal from her own mother was the final blow Madison needed to realize that her family would never accept Alessandro or their love. She felt completely alone, abandoned by the three people who had been her entire world. "You have until tomorrow morning to call off this engagement and end this relationship permanently," Robert declared with the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "If you choose to go through with marrying this man, then you're choosing to leave this family forever. There will be no wedding invitation, no visits, no contact until you come to your senses and repent of this sin." Tyler nodded in agreement, adding his own condemnation. "Dad's right, Madison. This marriage would be a disaster for everyone involved. Think about what you're throwing away: your family, your faith community, your entire support system." Madison looked around the room at the three people who had shaped her entire life, seeing strangers where once there had been unconditional love. "I can't believe you're making me choose between the man I love and my family," she said, her voice steady despite her breaking heart. "But if that's what you're demanding, then I choose Alessandro." As Madison headed for the door, Linda followed her with one last desperate attempt to save their relationship. "Please don't do this, Madison," she begged, grabbing her daughter's hands with tears streaming down her face. "Please don't marry him. We're your family. We love you more than anyone else ever could." Madison felt her heart shattering as she looked into her mother's eyes, seeing genuine love mixed with fear and prejudice. "I love you too, Mom," Madison whispered, "but I won't give up the man who makes me truly happy, not even for you." Behind Linda, Robert stood unmoved in the doorway, his expression cold and final. "When you're ready to call off this wedding and come home, you know where to find us," he called out with devastating finality. "Until then, you're no longer welcome in this house. You're no longer my daughter." Madison walked to her car feeling like she was attending her own funeral, leaving behind everything familiar to build a new life with Alessandro, knowing her family was lost to her forever. 3 months after the devastating confrontation with her family, Madison stood at the altar of a small interfaith chapel in downtown Cincinnati, wearing her grandmother's simple white dress that she had retrieved from her apartment before her family could stop her. Alessandro waited for her with tears in his eyes, understanding the pain this day brought alongside the joy. Only a handful of their closest friends attended: Jessica from college, a few teacher colleagues, and some of Alessandro's fellow doctors who had become like family to them both. The empty pews where her parents, Tyler, and extended family should have been sitting felt like physical wounds. But Madison tried to focus on the man who had chosen to build a life with her despite losing everything else that had once mattered to her. "Madison," Alessandro said during their vows, his voice thick with emotion as he held her hands, "you saved me from a life of loneliness and gave me hope for a future I thought I'd lost forever. I promise to love you through every storm, to be your family when your own has turned away, and to show you every day that choosing us was the right decision." Madison felt tears streaming down her face as she responded, "Alessandro, you taught me that love is stronger than fear, that faith is about compassion rather than judgment. I promise to build a new life with you, to create the family we both lost, and to never let anyone make me ashamed of the love we share." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was filled with both celebration and the bittersweet knowledge that this moment of pure joy was shadowed by the family who had chosen prejudice over love. That same Sunday morning, while Madison and Alessandro were celebrating their wedding with friends, Robert stood at the pulpit of Grace Baptist Church addressing his congregation of over 200 members. "It is with a heavy heart that I must share some personal news with you, my spiritual family," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of pastoral authority mixed with personal pain. "My daughter Madison has chosen to reject the faith and values we raised her with. Yesterday, she married a Catholic refugee in direct defiance of Scripture and our family's guidance." A murmur of shock and sympathy rippled through the congregation as Linda sat in the front pew, her face pale with humiliation and grief. "Therefore, as her father and your pastor, I am formally and publicly disowning her until she repents of this sin and returns to the truth we have taught her. The Morrison family will no longer acknowledge Madison as our daughter," Robert continued with devastating finality, his voice echoing through the sanctuary where Madison had been baptized, confirmed, and had planned to be married someday. "We ask for your prayers as we trust God to bring her back to righteousness. And we ask for your support as we navigate this painful season of discipline and separation." The congregation sat in stunned silence, many of them having watched Madison grow up in this very church. Linda's quiet sobs could be heard throughout the sanctuary as Robert essentially erased their daughter from their family in the most public way possible. Several long-time members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly troubled by the harshness of Robert's proclamation, but none dared to challenge their pastor's decision from the pulpit. The announcement sent shockwaves through the small community where Madison had lived her entire life. Unaware of the devastating scene playing out at her father's church, Madison walked down the aisle as Mrs. Romano, feeling a complex mixture of overwhelming happiness and profound grief. She had married the love of her life, but the absence of her family made the celebration feel incomplete, like a song missing its harmony. Alessandro squeezed her hand, sensing her emotional conflict, and whispered, "We're going to be okay, Mrs. Romano. We're going to build something beautiful together." Outside the chapel, their small group of friends cheered and threw rice, creating the celebration her family should have provided. Jessica hugged Madison tightly, whispering, "I'm so proud of you for following your heart. This is just the beginning of your real life." But even in her joy, Madison felt the phantom pain of her family's absence like a missing limb. 2 days after their wedding, Madison received a phone call from her former Sunday school teaching partner, Helen, who had attended Grace Baptist for over 30 years. "Madison, honey, I had to call you," Helen said, her voice trembling with emotion and embarrassment. "What your father did on Sunday, it wasn't right. He stood up there and told the whole congregation that you were dead to your family, that no one should contact you or acknowledge your marriage." Madison felt the blood drain from her face as Helen described the public humiliation her father had orchestrated. "He made it sound like you had committed some unforgivable sin." Half the congregation was crying, and the other half looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Madison sank into a chair, feeling like she had been punched in the stomach. Alessandro immediately came to her side, taking the phone when she became too overwhelmed to continue the conversation. The humiliation of her father's public disowning made staying in Cincinnati impossible for Madison. "We need to leave," she told Alessandro through her tears. "I can't stay in a town where everyone knows my own father has declared me dead to my family. Every grocery store, every restaurant, every street corner, people will be staring at me, pitying me, judging me." Alessandro immediately began making phone calls to colleagues in other cities, determined to get them away from the toxic environment Robert had created. Within a week, he had secured a position at a hospital in Portland, Oregon, and they began packing their belongings for a fresh start 3,000 miles away from the pain and public shame Robert had inflicted on his own daughter. "Maybe this is a blessing," Alessandro said gently as they folded their wedding photos into boxes. "We can start completely over, build our own traditions, create our own family away from all this hatred." As they drove west toward their new life in Portland, Madison watched the Ohio countryside fade in the rearview mirror and felt like she was escaping from a prison she hadn't realized she'd been living in. Every mile took them further from the community that had watched her father publicly destroy her reputation and disown her for choosing love over prejudice. "Are you sad to leave?" Alessandro asked gently, reaching over to take her hand as they crossed into Indiana. "I thought I would be," Madison replied honestly, "but I feel more relieved than sad. For the first time in my life, I get to be whoever I want to be, not just Pastor Morrison's perfect daughter. I don't have to live up to anyone's expectations except my own and yours." Alessandro smiled and squeezed her hand. "Then we'll create something beautiful together, something built on love instead of fear and judgment." Their new apartment in Portland was small but filled with light, overlooking a park where children played and families picnicked on weekends. As they unpacked their combined belongings, Madison felt the first stirrings of hope that maybe they really could build something beautiful together, far from the toxic judgment of her father's congregation. Alessandro had already started his new position at the hospital, working with refugees and underserved communities, while Madison had found a teaching job at an inner-city school where her compassion for struggling students would be deeply valued. "Look," Alessandro said, pointing out their window to a young family teaching their toddler to walk in the park below. "Someday that could be us, raising children who will never have to choose between love and family, who will grow up knowing that differences make us stronger, not weaker." 6 months into their new life in Portland, Madison and Alessandro had settled into comfortable routines that felt like the foundation of a real family, built on their own terms rather than inherited expectations. They cooked dinner together each evening, sharing stories from their respective workdays. Alessandro describing the refugee families he was helping to navigate the healthcare system, Madison talking about her diverse students' progress and breakthrough moments. Sometimes Madison felt waves of sadness about the family she had lost, especially during holidays or special moments when she wished she could share her happiness with her mother. But more often, she felt grateful for the peace and authenticity of their new life together. "Do you ever regret it?" Alessandro asked one evening as they prepared dinner. "Never," Madison replied firmly. "I regret that they couldn't love me enough to accept my choice, but I don't regret choosing a life of love over a life of fear. We're building something real here, something honest and beautiful." 5 years after their wedding, Madison and Alessandro welcomed their first child into the world, a beautiful daughter with Alessandro's dark curls and Madison's bright blue eyes. As Madison held baby Isabella for the first time, she felt overwhelming joy mixed with profound sadness that her parents would never meet their granddaughter. "She's perfect," Alessandro whispered, gently stroking the baby's tiny hand with his finger. "Look at those eyes. She has your father's eyes." The comment made Madison's heart ache as she realized that Isabella would grow up never knowing her maternal grandparents, never experiencing the unconditional love that grandparents typically provide. Yet holding her daughter also filled Madison with fierce determination to break the cycle of conditional love and prejudice that had destroyed her own family relationships. Back home in their cozy Portland apartment, Madison and Alessandro settled into the beautiful chaos of new parenthood. Alessandro had established himself as one of the most respected cardiologists at Portland General Hospital, known for his exceptional skill with complex heart surgeries and his compassionate bedside manner with patients from all backgrounds. The nursery they had prepared was filled with books in both English and Italian, reflecting their desire to raise Isabella with an appreciation for both cultures. As Madison nursed their daughter in the antique rocking chair Alessandro had found at a local market, she felt a completeness she had never experienced before. "I wish my mother could see her," Madison said softly, watching Isabella's tiny fingers grasp at the air. She always talked about becoming a grandmother someday, about teaching her grandchildren to bake cookies and garden. Despite her fear of rejection, Madison decided to send photos of Isabella to her parents, hoping that becoming grandparents might soften their hearts and open a door for reconciliation. She spent hours writing a letter describing their daughter's birth, her perfect health, and how much she looked like both sides of the family. "Dear Mom and Dad," she wrote, "I wanted you to meet your granddaughter, Isabella Grace Romano. She was born healthy and beautiful, and she has Dad's blue eyes and Alessandro's gentle nature." Alessandro has become one of Portland's most respected cardiologists, saving lives every day. "I know we've had our differences, but Isabella is your blood, and I hope that means something to you. I miss you every day, and I want Isabella to know her grandparents." Madison included several professional photos of the baby, hoping the images would be impossible for her parents to resist. With trembling hands, she sealed the envelope and addressed it to the home where she had grown up. 2 weeks later, Linda Morrison sat at her kitchen table holding the envelope from Madison with hands that shook from both excitement and fear. She had been hoping for some contact from her daughter for 5 long years, praying that Madison would reach out despite Robert's harsh ultimatum. When she opened the envelope and saw the photos of baby Isabella, Linda's heart melted instantly. "Oh my God, Robert, look at her!" she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she studied every detail of her granddaughter's perfect features. "She's beautiful. She looks just like Madison did as a baby. And listen to this. Alessandro has become a successful cardiologist. He's saving lives." Robert glanced at the photos over his wife's shoulder, and for a moment, his stern expression softened as he saw his own eyes reflected in the innocent face of his granddaughter. But then his jaw tightened with renewed determination. "It doesn't matter what he's accomplished," he said coldly. "Madison made her choice, and we made ours. How can you look at this precious baby and not feel anything?" Linda demanded, her voice rising with 5 years of suppressed grief and anger. "This is our granddaughter, Robert, our flesh and blood. Madison is reaching out to us. This is our chance to heal our family." But Robert remained unmoved, his pastoral pride and stubborn prejudice overriding any grandfather instincts he might have felt. "That child is being raised Catholic by a foreign father who has filled Madison's head with lies," he replied harshly. "Until Madison repents and comes home, that baby is nothing to us." Linda stared at her husband in horror, realizing that his heart had become so hardened by years of judgment and rigid thinking that not even the innocent face of his own granddaughter could penetrate his anger. "You're going to regret this," she whispered. "Someday when it's too late, you're going to regret choosing your pride over your family." 3 weeks after sending the photos, Madison found the envelope in her mailbox marked "Return to Sender" in her father's unmistakable handwriting. She felt like she had been punched in the stomach as she realized that her parents had rejected even the opportunity to know their granddaughter. Alessandro found her sitting on their front steps, holding the unopened envelope and crying with deep, body-shaking sobs. "They didn't even open it," she whispered in disbelief. "They sent back pictures of their own granddaughter without even looking at them." Alessandro sat beside her and pulled her into his arms, his own heart breaking for the family that was choosing to miss out on knowing their incredible daughter and beautiful granddaughter. "Their loss doesn't diminish our love," he said softly. "Isabella will grow up surrounded by so much love from us that she'll never feel the absence of people who were too stubborn to know her." Alessandro threw himself into his work at Portland General Hospital, where he had quickly established himself as one of the most skilled and respected cardiologists on the West Coast. His colleagues sought his expertise for the most complex cases, and his patient survival rates were among the highest in the region. Dr. Romano saved my husband's life, one grateful wife told the hospital administrator. He performed a surgery that 3 other doctors said was impossible. Alessandro's reputation for combining exceptional medical skill with genuine compassion had made him beloved by both colleagues and patients. Despite the pain of Madison's family rejection, he found purpose in healing hearts literally, even when he couldn't heal the metaphorical heart of his wife's broken family relationships. His success had given them financial security and professional respect that made their new life in Portland feel stable and hopeful. As Isabella grew into a curious and joyful toddler, Madison and Alessandro focused on building the loving family they had always dreamed of, creating new traditions that reflected both their cultures and their values. Sunday picnics in the park became their weekly tradition, where Isabella would chase butterflies while speaking the mixture of English and Italian that had become natural in their household. Mamma, guarda, Isabella would call out, pointing to flowers with the bilingual enthusiasm that made both parents smile. Watching their daughter's uninhibited joy and acceptance of everyone she met, Madison felt proud that they were raising a child who would never know the prejudice and conditional love that had destroyed her own family relationships. "She's going to be so much better than us," Madison told Alessandro as they watched Isabella share her snacks with another child at the playground. "She's growing up with love as her foundation, not fear." During Isabella's bedtime routine, Madison would read her stories from both American and Italian children's books, wanting her daughter to grow up appreciating both sides of her heritage. "Tell me about Nana and Nano in Italy," Isabella would ask, and Madison would share stories about Alessandro's parents who sent letters and photos from Tuscany, grandparents who loved Isabella deeply despite the ocean between them. When Isabella asked about Madison's parents, the conversation became more difficult. "Do I have other grandparents, Mama?" Isabella asked one evening with the innocent curiosity of a toddler. Madison's heart clenched as she struggled to find an age-appropriate way to explain the situation. "Yes, sweetheart, you do," Madison said carefully. "But sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and let their fears keep them from the people they should love. Maybe someday they'll be ready to meet you." Alessandro, listening from the doorway, admired how Madison handled these painful questions with honesty while protecting Isabella's innocent heart. As Isabella's second birthday approached, Madison and Alessandro spent an evening looking through photo albums of their growing family, marveling at how much their lives had changed since leaving Ohio. Alessandro's success as a respected cardiologist had given them a beautiful life, while Madison's teaching career flourished as she worked with diverse students who reminded her daily why love and acceptance mattered more than prejudice. The photos told the story of a family built on love rather than obligation. Birthday parties with friends from many cultures, holiday celebrations that blended Italian and American traditions, and countless moments of pure joy with their daughter. "Do you think they ever wonder about us?" Madison asked quietly, looking at a photo of Isabella taking her first steps. "Your parents," Alessandro replied. "I think your mother probably thinks about you every day. Your father, I think his pride is stronger than his curiosity, but even he must wonder about the granddaughter he's never met." Madison nodded sadly, then smiled as she turned to a photo of Isabella laughing with pure delight. "Their loss," she said firmly. "We've built something beautiful here, something real and honest." 3 years later, Madison and Alessandro welcomed their second child, a son they named Daniel, whose arrival completed their family in ways they had never imagined possible. Isabella, now 5 years old, was absolutely enchanted with her baby brother, gently stroking his tiny hand and whispering to him in a mixture of English and Italian that had become their family's natural language. "He's so little, Mama," Isabella said with wonder, carefully touching Daniel's dark hair that matched her own curls. "When will he be big enough to play with me?" Madison felt her heart overflow with love as she watched her daughter's immediate acceptance and protection of her new sibling. Despite the ongoing absence of her parents from these precious moments, Madison realized that the family she and Alessandro had built was complete and beautiful, filled with the unconditional love she had always craved but never received from her own upbringing. Back home, Isabella took her role as big sister very seriously, helping Madison organize Daniel's nursery and explaining to him all the important family rules and traditions. "This is where we keep the Italian books, baby Daniel," she said solemnly, pointing to the shelf of children's stories Alessandro read to her each night. "And this is where Mama keeps the English ones. Papa says we're lucky because we get 2 languages and 2 cultures." Madison had been promoted to principal of Lincoln Elementary School, where her work with immigrant and refugee families had earned her recognition throughout the district. Alessandro had become chief of cardiology at Portland General Hospital, his reputation growing nationally for his innovative surgical techniques and compassionate patient care. Their life had become everything Madison had dreamed of, professionally fulfilling, financially secure, and overflowing with the kind of love that asks nothing in return. As principal of Lincoln Elementary, Madison had transformed the school into a model of inclusive education that celebrated diversity and supported every child regardless of their background. Her office walls were covered with photos of graduation ceremonies, cultural celebrations, and student achievements that represented dozens of countries and languages. "Mrs. Romano has created something special here," the district superintendent told a visiting delegation. "Test scores are up, but more importantly, every child feels valued and supported." Madison's work had earned her statewide recognition for educational excellence, and she often spoke at conferences about building inclusive school communities. Her success felt especially meaningful because it was built on the same values that had caused her relationship with her family. The belief that differences should be celebrated, not feared, and that love should be unconditional rather than dependent on conformity to narrow expectations. Alessandro continued to save lives daily as chief of cardiology, performing complex surgeries that other doctors deemed impossible. His latest case involved a young Somali refugee whose heart defect had gone untreated for years due to lack of access to proper medical care. "Dr. Romano is our miracle worker," the patient's mother said through tears after the successful surgery. "He gave my son a future when everyone else said there was no hope." Alessandro's clinic had become a beacon for underserved populations, providing world-class cardiac care regardless of patient ability to pay. His innovative techniques were being studied by medical schools across the country, and his patient survival rates were among the highest in the nation. The boy who had once lost everything in Syria had grown into a man who dedicated his life to healing hearts and giving hope to families who had lost everything themselves. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Tyler Morrison sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through social media search results for his sister Madison. He had been secretly looking for her online for months, following breadcrumbs of information that led him to photos of her successful career, her beautiful family, and the life she had built in Portland. His computer screen showed pictures of Isabella and Daniel that Madison had shared on her school's website during cultural awareness events, and Tyler felt his heart break as he realized these were his niece and nephew whom he had never met. "Look how happy they are," he whispered to himself, studying a photo of Madison laughing with her students. "Look how successful she's become." For over an hour, Tyler stared at the compose message button on Madison's professional email, typing and deleting draft after draft of messages, attempting to reach out and apologize for the family's treatment of her. Tyler's finger hovered over the send button as he composed yet another message to Madison. "Dear Madison, I know I have no right to contact you after all these years, but I want you to know that I think about you and your family every day. I was wrong to side with Dad, and I'm sorry for the pain we caused you. Your children are beautiful, and I would love to know them if you'd ever consider." But once again, Tyler deleted the message, paralyzed by fear of rejection and uncertainty about whether Madison would ever want to hear from the brother who had chosen their father's prejudice over her happiness. The framed family photo on his desk showed the 4 Morrisons from Christmas 8 years ago, all smiling and happy, completely unaware that this would be their last holiday together. Tyler picked up the photo, running his finger over Madison's face. remembering the sister who had always been kinder and more compassionate than the rest of them. "I miss you so much," he said to the empty room. "I wish I had been brave enough to stand up for you." During their evening bedtime routine, Isabella's questions about her missing grandparents had become more sophisticated and heartbreaking as she grew older. "Mama, why don't your parents want to meet me and Daniel?" she asked one evening with the directness of a 5-year-old who was beginning to understand that their family situation was different from her friends. Madison felt her heart clench as she struggled to find an age-appropriate way to explain the situation without damaging Isabella's innocent trust in the world. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and let their fears become bigger than their love, Madison said carefully, smoothing Isabella's dark curls. "It's not because there's anything wrong with you or our family, sweetheart. It's because they're afraid of things they don't understand." Isabella considered this seriously, then asked, "Do you miss them, Mama?" Madison felt tears threatening as she replied, honestly, "Every single day, baby girl. But I would never trade the family we have now for anything in the world." After putting the children to bed, Madison and Alessandro sat together processing Isabella's increasingly complex questions about her missing grandparents. She started to realize that other families have grandparents who are involved in their children's lives, Madison said sadly. "I can see her trying to understand why hers don't care enough to meet her." Alessandro pulled Madison close, understanding how much these conversations wounded his wife's already broken heart. "Maybe it's time to try reaching out again," he suggested gently. "Isabella and Daniel deserve the chance to know their grandparents, and your parents deserve the chance to know these incredible children." Madison shook her head, still too wounded by years of rejection. "I can't handle another returned letter, another public humiliation. If they wanted to know their grandchildren, they would have responded to the photos I sent years ago." But even as she said the words, Madison felt a stirring of hope that maybe, somehow, 8 years might have softened her father's heart enough to allow some kind of reconciliation. At Lincoln Elementary's annual International Heritage Festival, Madison watched with pride as Isabella confidently presented about her Italian-American heritage to a gymnasium full of families from dozens of different cultures. "My papa came from Italy," Isabella explained to the audience, "and my mama's family has been in America for many generations. In our house, we speak 2 languages and celebrate traditions from both places." Madison felt tears of pride watching her daughter naturally embrace the multicultural identity that had caused so much conflict with her own family. Isabella moved easily between the Italian booth where she helped serve authentic pasta and the American Heritage display, where she explained traditional pioneer crafts. "She's remarkable," commented another parent. "You can tell she's being raised to see diversity as a strength rather than a threat." Madison nodded, knowing that despite the pain of losing her own family, she and Alessandro had succeeded in raising children who would never know the fear and prejudice that had torn her family apart. 8 years after leaving Ohio, as Madison and Alessandro sat together in their living room after putting both children to bed, they reflected on the beautiful family they had created despite the ongoing absence of Madison's parents and Tyler. Daniel was growing into a happy, healthy baby who brought joy to everyone he met, while Isabella was thriving as a confident, compassionate kindergartner who naturally embraced diversity and inclusion. "Do you ever wonder if Tyler thinks about us?" Madison asked, looking at a photo of their family from Isabella's birthday party. "I hope he does," Alessandro replied. "I hope he sees what he's missing and finds the courage to reach out someday." Madison nodded, thinking about the brother who had once been her closest friend before choosing their father's prejudice over her happiness. "Maybe someday he'll be brave enough to choose love over fear," she said softly. "But until then, we have each other, and we have the most amazing children in the world." That's enough. 10 years after disowning Madison, Robert Morrison stood at the pulpit of Grace Baptist Church, delivering his Sunday sermon about forgiveness and God's grace when a massive heart attack struck without warning. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son," he was saying when suddenly his words slurred, his face contorted in pain, and he clutched his chest with both hands. The congregation of 200 people watched in horror as their pastor collapsed behind the pulpit, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud that echoed through the sanctuary. Linda screamed from the front pew as church members rushed forward to help, but Robert lay unconscious and barely breathing, his face turning gray as his heart struggled to pump blood through blocked arteries. The irony was not lost on those present that the man who had spent a decade preaching about forgiveness was now fighting for his life, having never forgiven his own daughter for choosing love over his prejudices. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Robert's condition was critical as they worked frantically to stabilize him in the church sanctuary where he had ruled with such rigid authority for decades. "He's in cardiac arrest," the lead paramedic announced grimly as they performed CPR on the church floor. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Linda knelt beside her husband's unconscious form, tears streaming down her face as she watched the man who had been the center of her world for 30 years fight for his life. "Please don't take him," she prayed desperately. "I can't lose him too." The congregation formed prayer circles throughout the sanctuary, but many whispered among themselves about the tragic irony that Pastor Morrison was dying with a daughter he had refused to forgive, grandchildren he had never met, and a heart that had been hardened by years of judgment and pride. As the ambulance rushed Robert to the hospital, Linda realized with crushing clarity that their family might lose its patriarch before any reconciliation could ever happen. At the hospital, as doctors worked to save Robert's life, Linda faced the most difficult phone call she had ever made. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number for Lincoln Elementary School in Portland, a number she had secretly memorized years earlier but never had the courage to use. "Lincoln Elementary, this is Madison Romano speaking," came the voice that Linda had missed desperately for 10 years. "Madison," Linda whispered, her voice breaking with emotion and desperation. "This is your mother. Your father has had a massive heart attack, and the doctors say he might not make it through the night." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening as Linda rushed to continue before Madison could hang up. "I know we don't deserve to ask this of you after all these years, after everything we've done, but please, please come home. I can't lose both of you." Linda's voice dissolved into sobs as she realized she was begging the daughter they had publicly disowned to return to the family that had rejected her completely. Madison felt the world tilt on its axis as she processed her mother's words, 10 years of pain and abandonment flooding through her in an instant. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly, sinking into her desk chair as the weight of the situation hit her. "They're doing emergency surgery now," Linda replied through her tears. 3 major arteries are blocked, and they said the damage to his heart is extensive. "Madison, I know he's been stubborn and cruel, but he's still your father. And I miss you so much that some days I can barely breathe." Madison closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache of longing for the family that had cut her out of their lives so completely. Part of her wanted to tell Linda that they had made their choice years ago, that she couldn't just call when it was convenient and expect Madison to come running. But another part of her, the part that still remembered being Daddy's little girl before prejudice and pride destroyed their relationship, felt pulled toward Ohio despite all the pain that awaited her there. Madison sat in her car outside the school for 20 minutes, wrestling with the decision that would define the rest of her life. Should she return to the family that had publicly humiliated her, that had rejected her children, that had chosen prejudice over love for an entire decade? Her phone buzzed with a text from Alessandro. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you completely. But remember, forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you." Taking a deep breath, Madison realized that despite all the pain her parents had caused, she couldn't live with herself if her father died without her having the chance to say goodbye or attempt some kind of reconciliation. The scared little girl inside her who had once worshipped her daddy was crying out for one last chance to be seen and loved by the man who had shaped her entire understanding of faith and family. "I have to go," she whispered to herself. "Not for them, but for me. I have to try." Back at their apartment, Madison and Alessandro hastily packed bags while trying to explain to Isabella and Daniel why they needed to leave for Ohio immediately. "Is Grandpa going to die?" Isabella asked with the direct honesty of an 8-year-old who had never met the grandfather who had rejected her existence. "We don't know, sweetheart," Madison replied, kneeling to Isabella's level. "But he's very sick, and we need to go see him and your grandmother." Daniel, now 5 years old, looked confused about traveling to meet grandparents he had never heard much about. "Will they like us?" he asked innocently. Madison felt her heart break as she realized her children were about to meet family members who had spent years denying their existence. "I hope so, baby," she said softly. "I really hope so." Alessandro packed his medical bag, knowing that his expertise as a cardiologist might be helpful in understanding Robert's condition and treatment options. As they loaded the car for the long drive to Ohio, none of them could have predicted how dramatically this crisis would change their lives forever. The drive from Portland to Ohio felt endless as Madison wrestled with a decade of emotions while Alessandro navigated through the night. Isabella and Daniel slept in the back seat, exhausted from the sudden disruption to their routine and the emotional weight of finally traveling to meet the grandparents who had been mysterious figures in their young lives. "Are you sure about this?" Alessandro asked gently, watching Madison stare out the passenger window at the dark landscape flying by. "No," Madison replied honestly. "I'm terrified that we'll walk into that hospital and he'll reject us again, even on his deathbed. I'm scared that the kids will be hurt by people who should love them unconditionally. But I'm more afraid of living with regret if I don't try." Alessandro reached over and squeezed her hand, understanding that this journey was about more than just saying goodbye to a dying father. It was about Madison finally confronting the family trauma that had shaped her entire adult life and finding closure, whatever that might look like. Arriving at the hospital after 16 hours of driving, Madison felt her stomach churn with anxiety as she prepared to face the family that had disowned her and meet the mother she hadn't spoken to in 10 years. Isabella and Daniel held tightly to their parents' hands, sensing the emotional weight of this moment, even though they didn't fully understand it. "Remember," Madison told her children as they approached the hospital entrance, "these people are family, but they've been absent from our lives by their own choice. Be polite and kind, but don't feel like you have to earn their love. You're already perfect exactly as you are." Alessandro kissed Madison's forehead before they entered the building. "We're doing this together," he reminded her. "Whatever happens in there, we're a family, and nothing can change that." As they walked through the automatic doors of Ohio General Hospital, Madison felt like she was walking back in her past, unsure whether she would find reconciliation and healing or more rejection and pain. Outside room 314, Madison hesitated with her hand on the door handle, 10 years of hurt and longing warring in her chest as she prepared to see her father for the first time since he had publicly disowned her. Through the small window, she could see Linda sitting beside Robert's bed, looking older and more fragile than Madison remembered, while machines beeped steadily around her father's unconscious form. "He looks so small," Madison whispered, seeing the man who had once seemed larger than life reduced to a frail figure surrounded by medical equipment. Isabella tugged gently on Madison's sleeve. "It's okay, Mama," she said with the wisdom of a child who had been raised with unconditional love. "We're here to help, remember? That's what families do." Taking a deep breath and drawing strength from her daughter's innocent confidence, Madison slowly opened the door to the room where her father lay dying, not knowing whether this moment would bring healing or heartbreak, but knowing that she had to try. The moment Linda looked up and saw Madison standing in the doorway with Alessandro and their 2 beautiful children, she let out a sob that seemed to contain 10 years of suppressed grief and longing. "Madison," she whispered, rising unsteadily from her chair beside Robert's bed. "Oh my God, you came. You actually came." Madison felt her own tears starting as she looked at her mother, seeing how much the years of family separation had aged her, how much pain she carried in her eyes. "Mom," Madison said softly, stepping into the room with her family. "These are your grandchildren, Isabella and Daniel." Linda's gaze fell on the 2 children who had inherited the best features of both parents, and she covered her mouth with trembling hands. "They're beautiful," she breathed. "They're absolutely beautiful." as grandmother and grandchildren looked at each other for the first time. The room filled with the possibility of healing, even as Robert lay unconscious between them, the man whose pride and prejudice had kept this family apart for a decade. The reunion between Linda and Madison was 10 years in the making, filled with tears, regret, and overwhelming love as Linda tentatively reached out to touch her daughter's face. "I can't believe you're really here," Linda whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I've dreamed of this moment for so long, but I was afraid it would never come." Madison felt herself melting into her mother's embrace, all the hurt and anger temporarily dissolved by the desperate love of a mother who had missed her daughter every single day. Behind them, Robert lay unconscious and motionless, machines beeping steadily as he fought for his life. Isabella and Daniel watched with wide eyes as their grandmother knelt down to their level, tears streaming down her face. "You're even more beautiful than in the pictures," Linda said softly to Isabella. "And Daniel, you look just like your mama did when she was little." The children, raised with love and confidence, responded naturally to their grandmother's genuine affection, creating the family bond that should have existed from their birth. Tyler arrived at the hospital carrying coffee for his mother and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw Madison standing beside their father's bed with two children he immediately recognized as his niece and nephew from his secret online searches. "Madison," he said in disbelief, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it really you?" The siblings looked at each other across 10 years of silence and regret, both seeing how much the other had changed. Tyler looked older, worn down by years of carrying guilt about the family's treatment of Madison, while Madison appeared confident and successful, surrounded by the beautiful family she had built despite their rejection. "Hello, Tyler," Madison said quietly, unsure how to navigate this reunion with a brother who had chosen their father's side during the worst moment of her life. Isabella tugged on Madison's hand and whispered, "Is that Uncle Tyler?" The innocence in her question broke something open in Tyler's chest as he realized these children knew about him despite never having met him, while he had spent years pretending they didn't exist. Tyler knelt down in front of Isabella and Daniel, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the niece and nephew he had been too cowardly to know. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm your Uncle Tyler, and I've missed so much of your lives because I was scared and wrong and foolish." Isabella, with the natural compassion she had inherited from both parents, reached out and patted Tyler's shoulder. "It's okay," she said gently. "Mama taught us that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but that doesn't mean we can't love them." Tyler looked up at Madison with amazement and gratitude, tears streaming down his face. "You raised them to know about us, even after everything we did?" Madison nodded, wiping away her own tears. "They deserve to know they had family, even if that family wasn't ready to know them. I couldn't let your mistakes take away their right to love you." The moment marked the beginning of healing between siblings who had been torn apart by their father's rigid judgments, even as Robert lay unconscious, unaware of the reconciliation happening around his bedside. When Alessandro arrived at the hospital after parking the car, Linda and Tyler came face to face with the man they had been taught to see as the enemy who had stolen Madison away from their family. "This is my husband, Alessandro," Madison said with quiet pride. "He's chief of cardiology at Portland General Hospital." Alessandro stepped forward with professional grace, extending his hand to Linda despite knowing how his family had been treated. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. I've heard so much about you from Madison over the years." His genuine warmth and obvious medical expertise immediately challenged their preconceived notions about the foreign Catholic who had supposedly corrupted their daughter. "Could you tell us about Dad's condition?" Tyler asked hesitantly. Alessandro nodded and moved to Robert's bedside, checking the monitors and medical charts with the practiced eye of an expert cardiologist. "The damage is extensive," he said gently. 3 major arteries were completely blocked, and there's significant damage to the heart muscle. The next 24 hours will be critical. As Alessandro reviewed Robert's charts and spoke with the attending physicians, his expertise became immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Dr. Romano, one of the local cardiologists, said with obvious respect, "We've read your research on post-MI cardiac rehabilitation. Do you think there are any additional interventions we should consider?" Alessandro studied the test results carefully, then suggested several modifications to Robert's treatment plan that could significantly improve his chances of survival. "We should increase the dosage of the beta blockers and consider a different approach to the blood thinners based on his current kidney function," he explained to the medical team. Linda watched in amazement as the man her husband had demonized for a decade potentially saved Robert's life with his medical knowledge and compassionate care. "He's brilliant," she whispered to Madison. "Your father was so wrong about him." The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the foreign refugee Robert had rejected might be the very person who could save his life, even as Robert lay unconscious and unaware of who was fighting to keep him alive. With Robert unconscious and unable to hear their conversation, Linda finally broke down completely and poured out 10 years of regret and pain to the daughter she had lost. "Madison, I am so sorry," she sobbed, clutching Madison's hands desperately. "I was weak and cowardly, and I let your father's pride destroy our family. Every day, for 10 years, I've missed you so much that some days I could barely breathe. I should have stood up to him, should have fought for you, should have chosen my daughter over his stubborn prejudice." Madison felt her own tears flowing as she heard the pain in her mother's voice. "I've carried photos of you and the children hidden in my purse for years," Linda continued. "I've driven by your old apartment building hoping to catch a glimpse of you. I've called your school's main number just to hear your voice on a voicemail recording. I've been dying inside without you." The weight of a decade's worth of suppressed grief filled the room as mother and daughter held each other, trying to bridge years of forced separation while Robert lay fighting for his life, unaware that his family was finally healing around him. Tyler pulled Madison aside and made his own painful confession about the years of guilt and regret he had carried. "I've been following your life online for months," he admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "I've seen the articles about your work at the school, the photos of Isabella and Daniel at school events, Alessandro's medical achievements. I've written you emails dozens of times, but never had the courage to send them." Madison looked at her brother with surprise and sadness, realizing he had been suffering in silence while she assumed he didn't care. "I was wrong to side with Dad," Tyler continued. "I was young and scared, and I took the easy path instead of standing up for what was right. I've regretted it every single day since you left. Watching you build this incredible life, raise these amazing children, marry this brilliant man, I realized we lost the best person in our family because we were too proud and prejudiced to see the truth." Madison felt her heart breaking for the brother who had carried this burden alone for so long, and she reached out to embrace him as they both cried for the lost years and the family that should have been celebrating together all along. Throughout the evening, Alessandro quietly monitored Robert's condition, adjusting medications and consulting with the medical team to ensure optimal care for the man who had spent a decade hating him without cause. Linda watched in amazement as Alessandro treated Robert with the same professional care and personal attention he would give any patient, despite knowing how cruelly this family had treated his wife and children. "Why are you helping him?" Linda asked quietly, overwhelmed by Alessandro's grace and forgiveness. "Because he's Madison's father," Alessandro replied simply, checking Robert's heart monitor. "Because he's Isabella and Daniel's grandfather. Because healing requires someone to choose love over revenge, and today that someone is me." His gentle care and obvious expertise with cardiac patients gave the family hope that Robert might survive, even as the machines around his bed painted a picture of a man whose heart had been severely damaged. "Madison chose well," Linda whispered, finally understanding why her daughter had been willing to sacrifice everything for this remarkable man who embodied the very Christian virtues Robert had claimed to represent but had failed to practice. As the evening wore on, Isabella and Daniel struggled to understand why their grandfather remained unconscious and unable to meet them after they had traveled so far to see him. "When will Grandpa wake up to talk to us?" Isabella asked, looking at Robert's still form surrounded by machines. "We don't know, sweetheart," Madison replied gently, smoothing her daughter's hair. His heart is very sick, and his body needs to rest and heal. Daniel climbed carefully onto Linda's lap and asked, "Grandma, does Grandpa know we're here?" Linda's eyes filled with tears as she looked at this sweet little boy who should have been spoiled with grandparent love from the day he was born. "I hope so, baby," she whispered. "I hope he can feel how much love is in this room right now." Isabella walked to Robert's bedside and gently took his unresponsive hand. "Hi, Grandpa," she said softly. "I'm Isabella, and this is my brother Daniel. We've been waiting our whole lives to meet you, so you have to get better, okay?" The innocent faith of children filled the room with hope, even as the adults faced the very real possibility that Robert might never wake up to know the grandchildren he had rejected for so long. As midnight approached, the Morrison family maintained their vigil around Robert's bed, finally reunited, but facing an uncertain future as machines continued to monitor his critical condition. The medical team had done everything possible. Alessandra's expertise had optimized his treatment plan, but now it was a matter of waiting to see if Robert's damaged heart could heal enough for him to survive. Madison held Alessandro's hand as they watched their children getting to know their grandmother and uncle for the first time, the family bonds forming despite Robert's absence from the conversation. "Do you think he'll make it?" Tyler asked quietly. "His heart was severely damaged," Alessandro replied honestly, "but he's stable for now. The next few days will tell us more." Linda stroked Robert's forehead gently, whispering prayers and apologies for the years of family destruction his pride had caused. "Please wake up," she begged him silently. "Please wake up and see what we almost lost forever. Please wake up and meet these beautiful grandchildren while there's still time." The room was filled with love, forgiveness, and hope, but also with the heartbreaking awareness that Robert might never open his eyes to see the family reconciliation his near death had finally made possible. As dawn broke through the hospital windows after the longest night of their lives, Robert Morrison slowly began to regain consciousness for the first time since his massive heart attack. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually taking in the faces surrounding his bed, his wife Linda, his son Tyler, and then, with obvious shock and confusion, the daughter he hadn't seen in 10 years, standing beside two children he had never met. "Madison," he whispered hoarsely, his voice weak from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. "Are those?" His voice trailed off as he stared at Isabella and Daniel, seeing his own blue eyes reflected in Isabella's face and recognizing features that belonged to both Madison and himself. The room fell silent as everyone held their breath, waiting to see whether Robert's brush with death had changed his heart. Robert's gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in Alessandro, standing quietly in the background. One of the nurses quietly mentioned that Dr. Romano had consulted on his case and suggested the treatment modifications that had likely saved his life. Robert's eyes widened as he looked at Alessandro, realizing that the man he had spent 10 years hating without ever meeting had literally helped save his life. "You're Alessandro," Robert said weakly, his voice filled with complex emotions. "You helped save my life." The weight of a decade's worth of prejudice and pride began to crumble as Robert faced the undeniable truth that the foreign Catholic refugee he had demonized was not only brilliant and successful, but had shown more Christian grace than Robert himself had demonstrated in years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that his supposed enemy had become his savior. Isabella stepped forward with the confidence of a child who had been raised with unconditional love, while Daniel hid shyly behind his sister. "Hi, Grandpa," Isabella said simply, her voice clear and sweet. "I'm Isabella, and this is my brother Daniel. We've been waiting our whole lives to meet you." Robert felt tears streaming down his face as he looked at these incredible children who carried his blood and his wife's gentle spirit. Children he had rejected without ever knowing. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "You're both so beautiful." Daniel peeked out from behind Isabella and asked innocently, "Are you feeling better, Grandpa? Mama said your heart was very sick." The simple, genuine concern in the little boy's voice broke something open in Robert's chest that had been closed for 10 years. My heart is much better now, he replied softly, realizing that these children represented everything he had lost. With tremendous effort, Robert reached out his weak hand toward Madison, tears streaming down his face as 10 years of stubborn pride finally crumbled under the weight of love and regret. Madison, can you ever forgive me? He whispered, his voice broken with genuine remorse. I was so wrong, so incredibly wrong about everything. I let my fear and pride destroy our family, and I missed watching these beautiful children grow up because I was too stubborn to see the truth. Madison felt her own tears falling as she took her father's hand, feeling the frailty of the man who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating. I forgave you a long time ago, Dad, she said softly. I just didn't know if you'd ever be ready to accept it. Robert squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. I want to know everything about them, he said, looking at his grandchildren with eyes full of love and regret. I want to make up for lost time, if you'll let me. Alessandro stepped forward with the same professional grace and personal dignity he had shown throughout the crisis, approaching the bedside of the man who had spent a decade hating him without cause. Mr. Morrison, Alessandro said gently, I'm glad you're feeling better. Your family has been very worried about you. Robert looked up at this man who had helped save his life and raised his grandchildren with such obvious love and success. I owe you an apology that's 10 years overdue, Robert said, his voice heavy with shame and regret. I judged you without knowing you, rejected you without meeting you, and taught my family to hate you based on nothing but fear and prejudice. Alessandro's response revealed the depth of his character. What matters now is that you're alive and we're all here together, he said simply. Your grandchildren have been wanting to meet you their entire lives. That's what's important. Robert realized he was looking at a man who embodied every Christian virtue. As the morning progressed, the hospital room became a place of miraculous healing that went far beyond Robert's physical recovery. Linda embraced Alessandro with tears of gratitude, apologizing for years of unfounded prejudice and thanking him for helping save her husband's life. I'm so sorry for how he treated you, she whispered. You're everything Madison said you were and more. Tyler spent time getting to know Isabella and Daniel, marveling at their intelligence, kindness, and the obvious love that had shaped their young lives. They're incredible kids, he told Madison. You and Alessandro have done such a beautiful job raising them. The children, with the resilience and openness that comes from being raised with security and love, embraced their newfound family members with enthusiasm, as if 10 years of separation could be healed with hugs and stories and shared laughter. The room filled with the sound of genuine family joy for the first time in a decade. Despite his weakness, Robert insisted on hearing every detail about his grandchildren's lives, their school achievements, their bilingual abilities, their love of both cultures, their natural compassion for others. Isabella proudly showed him photos from her school's International Heritage Festival, explaining how she had presented about both her Italian and American heritage. I told everyone that being from two places makes me special, not different, she said with the wisdom of a child raised without prejudice. Daniel shyly showed Robert drawings he had made during the long car ride to Ohio, pictures of their family and their house in Portland. This is our family, Daniel explained, pointing to stick figures. And now we can add Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle Tyler. Robert felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he realized what he had lost through his own stubbornness. First steps, first words, birthdays, holidays, bedtime stories, all the precious moments that make up a grandparent's greatest joy. As Robert's strength returned throughout the day, he made a request that surprised everyone in the room. I want to renew your marriage vows, he told Madison and Alessandro, his voice growing stronger with each word. I want to do it properly this time, with your family present, with my blessing and support. I want to undo the damage I caused by refusing to celebrate your love the first time. Madison felt tears springing to her eyes as she realized her father was offering her the wedding blessing she had always dreamed of but thought she would never receive. Dad, you don't have to do that, she said softly. Yes, I do, Robert replied firmly. I need to publicly acknowledge what I should have said 10 years ago. That Alessandro is a good man who loves you completely, that your marriage is a blessing, and that I was wrong to oppose it." Linda clasped her hands together with joy, already planning the celebration they should have had a decade earlier. Word of Alessandro's expertise in helping to save Robert's life had spread throughout the hospital, and several staff members stopped by to express their admiration for his medical knowledge and compassionate care. "Dr. Romano, your suggestions made all the difference in Mr. Morrison's recovery," the chief of cardiology told him. Similarly, news of Madison's work as an award-winning principal had reached the local education community, and several Ohio school districts expressed interest in learning from her innovative approaches to inclusive education. Robert listened with growing pride as he learned about the professional achievements and community respect his daughter and son-in-law had earned. "I'm so proud of both of you," he told them, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've built something beautiful together, made a difference in so many lives. I should have been celebrating your success all along instead of mourning an imaginary loss." The recognition served as additional proof that they had not only survived but thrived. As the sun set on the most transformative day of their lives, Madison looked directly at the camera with tears of joy in her eyes, surrounded by the complete family that had seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. "Where are you watching from today?" she asked with a voice full of hope and wonder. "Have you ever thought it was too late to heal a broken family? Have you ever believed that love couldn't overcome years of hurt and misunderstanding?" She gestured to her father, still weak but smiling as he held Daniel on his lap, while Isabella showed him more drawings. "This morning, I thought I might be saying goodbye to my father forever. Tonight, my children are getting to know the grandfather who spent 10 years rejecting them." Alessandro squeezed Madison's hand as the sound of genuine family joy filled the hospital room. "If you've been separated from someone you love because of pride or prejudice or fear, please don't give up hope," Madison continued. "Love really does conquer all, but sometimes it takes a lifetime to prove it."